Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Johanna, and I'm from the UN Innovation Network. And this is our first webinar in a new learning series we're kicking off on the fundamentals of blockchain. In this series, we're going to try and dive a bit deeper into distributed ledger technologies and the applications for the UN. And you will see on the next slide that we'll be looking at things like the opportunities presented by blockchains. We'll also explore possible risks. We look at different elements of blockchain networks. We'll introduce you to different blockchains and also look at cryptocurrencies and decentralized finance. It's a jam-packed 7-week, but maybe more 7-month learning series where we're really trying to help you understand this new technology that offers so many opportunities as well as things to keep in mind. The learning series is open to all members of the UN Innovation Network, but to avoid spamming everyone, invitations for upcoming webinars will only be sent to members of the blockchain group. And this group is very similar to the group on behavioral sciences that we have, and it aims to bring together colleagues working in a slightly more narrow innovation space, so blockchain specific, and create opportunities for these blockchain innovators to connect, to exchange their experiences, to ask questions, and maybe get some help from other colleagues in the UN system. And so far, we have about 300 colleagues from across the UN who've joined this group. And it's really, really fascinating for us to see how much interest and how much expertise there is in this field. So if you would like to join the future sessions coming up as part of this learning series, we encourage you to sign up to the blockchain group, and we'll put the link to that in the chat in just a moment. Before I hand over to our presenter for the day, I just wanted to let you know that we are going to make this webinar, and hopefully all webinars in this learning series, as interactive as possible. And so we have built in little quizzes and checkpoints throughout to see if we're doing a good job introducing blockchain to you. So pay attention, we'll be quizzing you, and we will also try to take clarifying questions throughout. So if there's anything that you would like to know, please feel free to put it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You'll really help us a lot by using the Q&A box instead of the chat for questions. And you'll help us even more if you can upvote what people have asked so that we can see what is most relevant to you. And because we have a jam-packed agenda today, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Christina. She is the lead of the blockchain team at UNICEF. Prior to that, Christina worked in consulting and in government. She's also lectured at NYU and MIT. So it's a great pleasure to have you, Christina. I know just how busy you are, so we really appreciate you joining us today. For those of you who are interested in blockchain, you may have met Christina virtually before when she introduced us to the Practical Guide to Innovation and the Atrium, which I think is going to come up in the session again today. So thank you, Christina. It's so nice to have you back with us, and handing over to you for the one-on-one on blockchain.
Perfect. Thank you so much for having me. And for those who might be seeing my video and concerned that I may be in an office setting, I'll just start off by saying that not to worry, it's a virtual background, that some lovely photos we took of the offices before we left, but happy to be joining you virtually for this session, looking at the fundamentals of blockchain. And as Johanna mentioned in the opening, we're really going to be covering the basics of blockchain today. Over the 7 sessions that she has planned for you, you'll be diving into a whole slew of different concepts. And my goal today is to really give you a base knowledge that you need to go into those sessions. And so we'll be talking about multiple concepts at a very, very high level. And then the following sessions will kind of break down each of those concepts a little bit further. So I just wanted to manage expectations that if you are an expert in blockchain, you might already know the content, but a refresher is never bad. And this will really be the basics so that you can then take this and leapfrog into those next sessions. I want to spend a good portion of today also in Q&A. So as Johanna mentioned, please use the Q&A box, and we will try and address as many questions as possible throughout that. If we're not able to get to all of them, there'll be an opportunity for follow-up afterwards, and I'll explain that a bit more soon. So just to get started, we're going to start with our first poll of the day. This is to help me get a sense of where you're at, and I can kind of tailor the presentation a little bit one way or another And so if you could just use the poll box, I see we have a good portion of people who kind of get it, but have some gaps, some people starting from the beginning, and we have a couple experts. So the experts on the call, like I said, this might not be the perfect session for you, but that's okay. And the next few sessions, we'll dive deeper into some other concepts. Okay, so the poll has closed and it looks like at least 50% are starting from the beginning and 47% have some gaps. So I think that's perfect for the type of content that we're going to be covering today. And with that, we can go ahead and get started. Okay, so to start having the conversation about blockchain, I think it's really important to talk about where blockchain came from and what it's evolved from. We often talk about blockchain as this really exciting new technology, and while it is exciting, I'm not sure it's as glamorous or as hyped as we often talk about it. It's really just the evolution of technologies that have already existed for many decades. And so it's the evolution of databases or cryptography or network dynamics. And so all of these IT concepts that have been around for a while, but had never been put together and used as one concept. And so in the 90s, there was the introduction of taking data and actually chaining data together and creating this chain of data. And then it wasn't until in 2008, in a paper that was released to the internet in 2008 by a group or someone named Satoshi Nakamoto, that introduced the concept of blockchain itself. And so that paper was called Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system, and primarily focused on Bitcoin, which allowed someone to transfer value across the world. But that was the first introduction of bringing together databases and cryptography and network dynamics, and the first introduction of that. The word blockchain is not actually used in that paper, funny enough. We don't see the word blockchain introduced until the year later. Accompanying code for Bitcoin was introduced, and it was in the code that we see that this technology is then named blockchain. But really, what is blockchain? So we know where it came from. It's the evolution of technology. It's a group or someone named Satoshi Nakamoto that takes these technologies that already existed and essentially creates that into something called blockchain. But what is it? So let's talk about that a little bit. Blockchain is essentially a ledger of information where at a certain point in time, it's decided that the information in that ledger can no longer be changed. And a good way of thinking about this is that if we all decided on this call to have a shared ledger of information, we could decide the rules that every 10 minutes, we're going to lock the spreadsheet that we're working on. We're no longer going to allow anyone to edit it, but we can continue editing. So there would be a line in that spreadsheet. Everything above would be locked, everything below we could continue editing for 10 minutes, and then we would know it'd be locked again. Everyone's able to see that information. We're all sharing that information, and it becomes immutable at a certain point in time. That is very much the characteristics of a blockchain. It is a ledger of information. Now, it's a ledger of information that actually exists on thousands of computers around the world. And so this actually makes it more secure. There are thousands of copies of information that exist around the world when you're using a blockchain. And this means that if a hacker were to get into my computer, for example, and to change my ledger of information, it doesn't matter because there are thousands of other copies around the world that have the correct information. And so a hacker would actually have to get into more than 50% of the computers around the world to be able to change that ledger. That's quite difficult, and we'll dive into that a little bit later on. So it makes it more secure. You have information that can't be changed. You have lots of people who have the same set of information. And on top of that, there is something called digital rules or smart contracts that can be used in the context of blockchain itself. And so smart contracts are essentially just programming digital logic. And a good example of this would be similar to paying your rent on a monthly basis. So you might set that at the end of each month, a certain amount needs to be withdrawn from your account and sent to your landlord. or pay your mortgage. And so a smart contract acts very similarly, where there are if-then conditions. So if you're familiar with Excel and the if-then function, if these conditions are met, then this is the result. And you can do the exact same thing in a blockchain, where you have this ledger of information that stores a whole bunch of information, and you can apply these rules on top of it. So you can use it, for example, to say, one good example is in the insurance industry. And back when we used to be on flights a little bit more often, you could buy flight insurance quite easily. That was based on blockchain. And what you would do is, if you were purchasing it for a particular flight on a specific day, it would tell you a dollar value that you would have to pay and what the payout would be if your flight was delayed. And there might be one payout amount if your flight was delayed 30 minutes, a different payout amount if your flight was delayed over 2 hours, let's say. But the smart contract would say, if flight AC 827, let's use that as a flight example, is delayed greater than 30 minutes, then pay Christina 10 euros. And if the conditions were met, then I would automatically be paid 10 euros, and I don't have to go through the lengthy process and paperwork that you typically have to do with airlines. The source of data which they're looking for these digital rules is called an oracle, and that's the information source by which they're going to check if the conditions for the digital rules were met. So in this case, FlightAware or any of the flight tracking websites could be that oracle that we're looking to see whether the rules are met. And if they are, what will happen is that the rule will actually know the payout automatically needs to be sent to me and to any other individuals on the flight who the flight was delayed more than 30 minutes and they had bought in insurance. And so smart contracts are really just digital rules, and we can program them in a whole variety of ways to see whether certain conditions are met and to automatically execute some actions. So with that, I think it's really important to note, we talked about Bitcoin really briefly as the first example of where blockchain was introduced, but Bitcoin is often confused with blockchain, and they really are two separate things. Bitcoin is an example of what you can store in your ledger of information. So in the case of Bitcoin, you would have, Christina owns 1 Bitcoin. Johanna owns 2 Bitcoin. And if I were to transfer 1 Bitcoin, that ledger would then update to say, Christina -1, Johanna +1, total equals 3. And so it's just a ledger of information that's being updated. However, you can also have other information that's being stored in a blockchain. It doesn't have to purely be financial. So Bitcoin is the first example. It's a financial example, but you could also put credentials. You could put, when you complete this learning course with UNIN, you could put that credential on a blockchain for everyone to see and for it to be immutable. And so you could have access to it anywhere in the world. You could also have land titles that are tracked. And these are real examples of blockchains being used, not just in the world, but in the context of the UN. Credentials and land titles are two very popular use cases, and I'll talk through some of those in just a little bit. So just to understand that the content of the ledger can be a variety of different things, it's always written onto a blockchain. So just to reiterate, Bitcoin and blockchain are not the same thing. Bitcoin is a type of application. It will have its own blockchain, but the blockchain can actually be used for other things other than cryptocurrency. So they can be separated in that case. So just to note again that this becomes really powerful to use blockchain in the context of these digital rules and smart contracts. So you have this large ledger of information that then can be used for various applications. So you could have a series of rules, for example, if my land titles in a country are stored on a blockchain, you could query all of the land that doesn't have any ownership, and you would be able to set a rule to automatically pull those for you. Or you could set a rule automatically for payment to be made for tax purposes for land titles via blockchain. And so those are some examples of digital rules that you may have been manual processes in the past that you can automatically digitize and put into a blockchain once you have a set of rules that you want against that data. I'm going to quickly pause because there's a common misconception around smart contracts, and I think it's in the naming. So a quick poll of, are smart contracts legal contracts? And this is always really confusing for the lawyers, particularly looking at the word smart contract. Is it not? I don't know, let's see. I'm seeing a lot of it depends. I feel like that's a safe choice on this one. I'm seeing 15% saying yes, 30% saying no. Give it a few more seconds to get in your final votes. Okay, so we have about 15% that says it depends, and you are absolutely right. It does depend. A smart contract, even though it's called smart, isn't always very smart and is not by default a legal contract. You would have to have a paper-based contract typically to accompany a smart contract if you want it to be legally binding. And so a smart contract by itself is not legally binding, but if you were to have a legal contract that then specifies that you're going to have these digital rules, it then can become legally binding. And so it's really important when you're talking about smart contracts to understand the default is that it's not a legal contract and that there is some effort and work required. Just because you have a smart contract doesn't negate traditional contracts that you need to put together. So thank you for participating in that poll. I think once we've gone over the basics of blockchain being this ledger of information that we're sharing across multiple parties, it's important to talk about why would you want to use a blockchain? So what are the benefits, and in what scenarios would you actually use a blockchain? And that's where we get to the key features of a blockchain. So a key feature of a blockchain is an element of trust between the parties. And I use the really broad definition of trust here. So if we're looking at this of why would you want to use a blockchain? If there are multiple parties who need access to a common set of information, but might not trust each other to manage that in a traditional database, where one person has sole access to the database and everyone else is being granted access to the database, blockchain acts as a nice technology for multiple entities to have access to the information where everyone understands the rules of engagement. So in a blockchain, for example, I gave the example earlier around every 10 minutes locking the information in that database or in the blockchain. And that's an example of the Bitcoin blockchain. Every 10 minutes, the information becomes immutable, a new block of information is added, and you can no longer change the information because it's chained to the previous block. And this element of trust is because everyone knows that there's an element of immutability. Everyone knows that the rules are that every 10 minutes, this is going to become immutable. Everyone knows what the rules of engagement are to be able to join. And so that's where blockchains create this element of trust. Now, around the element of immutability or information not being able to be deleted, and I think that's an important thing to call out because it's both a good and a feature to be considered. Not all information should be stored on a blockchain, but if there is information that would be worth having public, having transparency, and knowing that no one has ever tampered with that information, no one has ever edited that information, that's where the element of immutability comes in. And that can be helpful in scenarios where you're worried about censorship, for example, excuse me. And I think that ties really well into the next feature, which is security. I talked about how blockchains have thousands of copies around the world and how there will be thousands of copies that if someone was trying to tamper with the information, it would make it very difficult to do so. And so there's this increased security. And not just if someone was trying to tamper with it, but let's say the internet were to go out in all of North America, then there would still be copies of this information that is readily available in South America and in Europe and in the African continent and in Asia, because again, it's distributed across the world. And so that's that element of security. You often hear about blockchain being transparent as a key feature, and I think it's important for us to unwrap what that actually means. So anyone who has access to the internet is able to see the transactions that are taking place. You'll be able to see them in a pseudo-anonymous manner. So it's just a long string of letters and numbers and probably some value. And so you probably don't know it's me, Christina Lamazo, who's transacting on the blockchain, but if I were to share my pseudo-anonymous string with you, you might know that that's me, and you could go back and you could see all the transactions I've ever made. And so transparent is that you can actually see each transaction that's happening in the blockchain as long as you have an internet connection. And then coordination really being a key feature. If we think of this specifically in the context of the UN, where we're often working interagency, blockchain acts as a great way to share information across multiple parties and to reduce the need for reconciliation at the end of the day, because you're all working off of a common set of information. And so we have multiple examples within the UN of blockchain being used to help coordinate some of that information. I'm just going to take a quick minute to pause. I see that there's some questions coming into the Q&A. And okay.
Indeed. Thank you, Christina. Let me help you because there's a couple coming in.
Sure.
And we're really going to focus on questions at this stage that are related to the content that you've presented, and keep kind of more general questions or ones that exceed the knowledge that we've introduced you so far at this stage. So there's one from Alexander that I would like to take, and he's wondering if you could explain the concept of transparency again. And he's saying it's probably somewhat different to the concept that he has in his mind. So your thoughts on that would be appreciated.
Yeah, absolutely. So the element of transparency, and I think that this will become a little bit more clear in a few slides when we talk about different types of blockchains, because transparency actually means something a little bit different in various contexts. But what it ultimately means is that whoever is part of a blockchain network is able to see the information that is being shared across that blockchain. And so having transparency across multiple stakeholders, if we want to use an example of the UN, multiple UN agencies being able to see the same set of information. Again, adding that in with this element of immutability. So you're trusting that the information that's part of this blockchain is actually valid data, that it's relevant data, and that there's some value in actually sharing it across multiple groups who need access to that information. And that looks a little bit different in different blockchain setups, but I'll elaborate on that in a couple slides.
Thank you, Christina. And maybe we'll take one more question here from Paul from the United Postal Union, apologies. And he's wondering, how does security commons benefit if it is spread on computers all around the world?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And when we're talking, so this is really, it's a key feature here. It could be a good feature or not a good feature. You have to be very deliberate and thoughtful around what information you're putting onto a blockchain. If you want something to not be permanent and there forever, a blockchain is probably not the best choice. Or there might be a different construct in how you want to share that information on a blockchain. So you'll often hear people talk about something called a hash. A hash is essentially just a digital identifier of some type of data. It might be an essay, it could be an email, it could be a media file. And there's a concept called a hash that actually takes that media file, that email, that document, and creates a long string of letters and numbers that you can't actually tell what was the content of the email, but you know that at a certain point in time what that email looked like. So you can only if you have the original email, can you prove what the identifier is. You could put the identifier on a blockchain if there was value in showing that the email was in its original state on November 22nd at 10 p.m. You could put that on a blockchain perhaps, and that's not actually exposing any of the sensitive data that was in the email. And maybe that's of some value in that particular use case. But it's really important to have conversations around what belongs on a blockchain versus what doesn't. In some scenarios, it's valuable to have thousands of computers around the world actually sharing a common set of information. So if we think about this in the most basic use case, or the first use case, which is around Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, the security comes in that thousands of computers around the world are actually sharing a set of information around who owns what the balances are of everyone around the world, and making sure that those transactions are approved by thousands of computers around the world, because you don't have a central entity who's deciding on that. It's these thousands of computers that have decided on a set of rules to agree to. And so that's where the element of security comes in. But it's not always a benefit. It's something that you need to consider as a potential drawback as well.
Thank you so much, Christina. I'd say at this stage, let's move on. There's lots of questions coming in for you, but let's go through the rest and we'll come back to some of these questions later.
Perfect. Sounds good. Okay, so a few more concepts to get through that I hope will deepen our knowledge a little bit and perhaps answer some of the questions that you have as well. So having talked about what the key features of blockchains are, I think it's important to talk about what are the main use cases. And there's typically three big buckets that we see. The first and most basic application is really storing information. And so we talked about public records, or for example, one that you'll see very often is around supply chain and tracking the different statuses of goods throughout a supply chain. That would be really the storing information, putting data onto a blockchain and having multiple parties have access to that information. The second function is really tracking the exchange of value. And so this is where you start to get into the idea of cryptocurrency and blockchain being used to actually transfer value between individuals. But it doesn't just have to be cryptocurrency either. It can also be some type of representation of some type of fiat or US dollars or euros or yens or dinars that are represented on a blockchain, that all of these transactions might take place between multiple entities. And at the end of the day, the blockchain is used as a common source to see where settlement needs to happen between multiple groups, but using blockchain as that common ledger to track all of that transfer of value, doing that in real time, having that common source of information. And then lastly, we've briefly touched on this around digitizing and automating rules. And this is really around the efficiency of an organization, looking at whether you can take rules that maybe are very paper-based, digitizing those with a common set of information on a blockchain, or maybe it's something around efficiency and incentivizing individuals to do something. So maybe you want students to complete a learning module and you want to incentivize them a little bit. You can actually enable that through a set of rules on a blockchain, where then you're able to track their contribution, but you're also able to track the reward that you're giving them. You're able to do this in an open, transparent way. Perhaps there's some value in doing that over traditional systems. Again, it's a case-by-case basis. I think what's important to note here is that blockchain is not always the right answer. And it's important to understand and have the tools to support you in making the decisions around when blockchain is the right fit and when it's not. And I'm going to show you a few of those tools that you might be able to use to support you in those explorations, because we definitely won't have all the time today to go through those. But I think what's important to point out is specifically the types of blockchains. And I'm not going to get into all of them. I'm just going to talk about two major categories of blockchains. There are public blockchains and there are private blockchains. Public blockchains I like to think of very similar to public parks. Anyone can participate, anyone can see what's happening in the park. That's a public blockchain. A public blockchain is what you would have heard of in the news around Bitcoin or Ethereum. anyone can keep a copy of the ledger. So a copy of ledger is called a node, or a computer that's running the information. Anyone is able to join in a public network. Anyone is able to see the information as long as they have an internet connection. A private blockchain is more like a gated park where a select few get to go in and enjoy. And even the fence, you might be able to see what's going on inside, but maybe it's a wooden fence and you can't actually see anything that's happening inside. And so a private blockchain would be, for example, if everyone on this call, we decided to set up a private blockchain, we would be the only ones who had copies of the ledger. We would be the only ones who are able to add content to the ledger. We would be the only ones who'd be able to see the content in that ledger. So important to understand that public and private, two very different types of blockchains. A private blockchain is much closer and shares a lot of similarities with a traditional database. And so really, when you're looking at a private blockchain, you're looking at maybe having more copies of the database or the ledger than you would traditionally have, some element of immutability, but that gets a little bit more difficult with a private blockchain. I saw that there was a question in the Q&A about hearing that blockchains are supposed to be immutable, but that's not always the case. It depends on how many computers have a copy of the ledger and what the rules of engagement in that blockchain is. So in a public blockchain, and if we talk about the two largest ones, the Bitcoin blockchain and the Ethereum blockchain, those are immutable. Once a transaction has been submitted, you cannot change what has gone into that blockchain. In a private blockchain, if it was a blockchain with just one entity, first you might want to be asking why you have a blockchain if you're just one entity, because that's very similar to a database. But if you don't have a distributed enough group who have access over that, then you start running into some issues where maybe the data could be changed, and that doesn't hold true to what a blockchain is really meant to do, which is to be immutable. And so that's where you need to start thinking about, is blockchain really the right fit? So with that, I want to quickly pause for a poll. Based on your knowledge to date, and I feel like I might have alluded to some of this a little bit, based on what you know so far, are there UN entities using public and private blockchains? So maybe we're just using private blockchains, maybe we're using private, maybe it's both, maybe no blockchains are being used. Okay, I see some pretty split responses on this. I'm getting a good majority that are saying both, and a few that are saying none, few public only, and a few private only. Okay, so I have to tell you that those who voted both, you are correct, that there are use cases within the UN that are both public uses of blockchains and private uses of blockchains. And I'm going to allude to some of those in just a little bit. But of course, there'll be sessions dedicated to how blockchain is being used across the UN. And now you'll know to be able to ask the question, are you using a public blockchain or are you using a private blockchain? And you'll understand that those really allude to different things and different benefits for the different types of blockchains. So with that, I wanted to share one last concept that is common across most blockchains, whether you're using a public blockchain or a private blockchain, to actually be able to interact with some type of blockchain-based application. You actually need to have a blockchain wallet. And a blockchain wallet is a way for you to actually have a digital signature. And this is where I was talking about some of the cryptography earlier in this call, and that being applied in the context of blockchain. That's where we have something called a public key and a private key that come together to create a digital signature. And you can think of a public key like your email address, or in this case, even your bank account number. It's something that's going to be able to tell us, how do we identify you in the ecosystem of a blockchain? And then you have a private key, which is more similar to a bank PIN, for example. And that's something that you want to keep very private. You don't want to share it with anyone. But when you combine your public address or your public key and your private key, those make a very unique digital signature that only you with those two things would be able to create that digital signature. No one else would be able to replicate it unless they had these two elements and would be able to mimic you. So it's incredibly secure in knowing that a digital signature is from you, because there's these two elements that come together to create it. Now, what's important to keep in mind with blockchain wallets specifically is that this sensitive information, or your bank PIN, for example, which in this case is a private key, you're not always the owner of it. And it's important to know whether you do have full access, and if you do have full access and control over it, that's called a non-custodial application. You have full control. That also comes with a lot of responsibility. If you lose that private key, there's no one that you can go to reset that password. But it also means that you can take that private key and no one else can stop you from creating your digital signature. So there are pros and cons of non-custodial versus a custodial model, which is where this private key and this sensitive data is managed on your behalf. And this is more similar to models that we're used to in applications that we deal with today, where if we lose our password, we can just request a reset. That's very similar in a custodial model where it's managed on your behalf. If you lock yourself out, you can request a reset, but it also means you don't have full control over your digital signature, because it means that the application that's managing the private key on your behalf can actually stop you from doing certain things. And maybe that's good, maybe that's bad. Again, it's scenario specific, and we're not going to dive super deep into these, but I wanted to just point this out as an example of a consideration. And again, this will be discussed in later classes. The whole idea of this first course is to introduce concepts that you should be aware of, and that then will be broken down further in following sessions. So something to be aware of, something to ask questions about. Having said all that about blockchain wallets, I'm really curious to know if folks on this call have ever set up a blockchain wallet before. So we're going to launch a quick poll here just to get a sense before we go into some use cases. So just quickly let us know, have you set up a blockchain wallet before? Yes or no? Okay, I'm seeing a good portion. We're right now about 80% of you have never set up a blockchain wallet before. And I think it would be a great exercise for you to go through the process of actually being able to set up a blockchain wallet. Just having that experience will help you understand the elements I just talked about of the public address and the private address actually coming together to create a digital signature, having that private key and that sensitive information. And I'm actually going to recommend some next steps. If you haven't set up a blockchain wallet before, at the end of this session, I'm going to give you some suggestions on where you can go and do that, to just go through the motions of doing that. It's fairly easy to do, but a good learning experience. So with that, let me briefly talk about some use cases, and then we're going to open up the floor for some Q&A. So given that I work at UNICEF, I thought it was only appropriate that I talk about some of the use cases at UNICEF, but just to note that there are dozens of projects happening across the UN, and I'm going to point you to where you can learn more about other UN projects that are happening. But I think when folks learn about how many use cases are happening on blockchain across the UN, they're always really pleasantly surprised about the amount of projects underway. So we talked about three main use cases for blockchain, one being data, then value exchange, then the element of efficiency and/or smart contracts. And in the context of our work here at UNICEF, under the framework of data, I think one of the easiest examples that I can share with you is that we've run learning courses internally at UNICEF before. And one of the things that we're able to do is to provide digital learning certificates that are based on blockchain when individuals finish the course. And that means that they have this certificate that's viewable by anyone, that will be there forever, that they won't lose a physical piece of paper, and that they can continue to build credentials against their name. And so that's an element of storing data on a blockchain. The next is tracking the exchange of value. And for us at UNICEF, we last year in October 2019, launched the UNICEF Crypto Fund. And this was the first use of cryptocurrency within the United Nations. So we don't convert the cryptocurrency to local currency at any point. We accept it from donors in cryptocurrency. And then we actually make early stage investments into startups using cryptocurrency. So UNICEF has had a venture fund for about 5 years. We've used the same framework, but are now leveraging cryptocurrency for two main reasons. One is around the actual tracking of the cryptocurrency. We're able to see the funds flow in, we're able to see the funds go out to the startups, and we're able to see when the startups spend their crypto. We talked about transparency and what that tangibly means. In this case of the crypto fund, anyone is able to see how much cryptocurrency UNICEF is holding at any point in time, and is able to verify that we've made transfers to these startups. And you can even see if the startups have spent their funds and where they've spent their funds. And so that is an example of value exchange. And lastly, on Digicus, this is an example in the UNICEF Kazakhstan office of streamlining business processes related to cash transfer on a platform called Digicus, which was a prototype to essentially mimic business rules that we have around moving funds to implementing partners, and how we would do this via blockchain, again, for the transparency, but also the efficiency. So this is the second point, even for the crypto fund, but also for Digicus, around the efficiency, which is the speed and the low cost of transferring funds. And so on a public blockchain, for example, when we're making the investments to the companies, we were able to move about, we made 28 investments, give or take. We moved about $200,000 in under 20 minutes for under $20. I feel like I'm getting my numbers off there. Hold on, let me go back to that. So 8 investments, they each received about, okay, so it was about, we're a little bit closer to $400,000 if less than 2% in transaction fees. And we were able that's what we were looking at from an efficiency standpoint in UNICEF Kazakhstan. We're not actually using crypto. And efficiency that a blockchain provides to actually use digital rules to streamline. If a milestone is met, then payment is released. And so those are some examples. Suggest that you go and visit was published by the UN Innovation Network back in May. And the URL is at the bottom of the page, or Innovation Network's blockchain page. Any steps that I talked about today, you'll be primer and understand some of the fundamentals. It does have decision trees and a set of questions that you should ask yourself when you're actually looking at whether blockchain would be the right fit or not. And it also has a group of use cases. So,
Christina, sorry to interrupt you. Just a quick note to say that we are having a few problems with your audio and visual. So you keep on freezing on us, which is a shame because it's been really interesting. If you can move to a better location. Oops, I wonder if we've lost Christina. Christina, I might try and turn off your video to see if that helps. Hi, Christina.
Hi, are you able to hear me?
We can hear you now, yes.
Okay, so sorry about that. Not sure what happened.
Right.
It's one of those working in the digital world, figuring out internet connectivity. Okay, so were you
seem to
able
have you
to?
loud and clear, but maybe if we can just recap on the, can we start again with the practical guide to blockchain, please? And then.
Sure.
Thank you.
No problem. And apologies everyone for the internet connection there. Okay, so the practical guide to blockchain is a guide that was published by the UN Innovation Network in May of this year. And it will dive deeper into all of the concepts that I've talked about today. So if you want to revisit some of the fundamentals around what blockchain is, what are cryptocurrencies, or where is blockchain being used within the UN, there is many use cases included in the practical guide itself. But most importantly, there are a set of tools to help you decide whether blockchain should be the right fit or not. And so there are a set of 10 questions to ask yourself, and it will point you to whether blockchain is more or less likely. And then finally, a decision tree, which will walk you through various steps. So the link is there, but it's also on the UN Innovation Network's website for the blockchain group as well. And finally, really, if you want to continue to expand your learning beyond what is shared in this session or in other sessions, there's the Atrium. And the Atrium is an interagency platform that's been developed for UN entities and individuals to actually go on and to seek out additional learning resources about blockchain, to share UN blockchain projects. I think we're currently at about 15 projects that have been shared on the Atrium, if I'm not mistaken. And you can actually interact with the project owners of those different projects. Some folks share documentation. And there's also a community forum. So if you have particular questions that you're interested in getting answers to, that's where I suggest you go. And I mentioned if you hadn't set up a blockchain wallet, I would actually suggest that you go to the forum. After this, I'm going to post on the forum how to set up a blockchain wallet. And I would be happy to work with you through the forum if you run into any issues. While doing that, happy to answer your questions and to really use that as an opportunity to engage with you. So we are going to go into Q&A now. Here are some of the most common questions. I'm happy to answer these or happy to take some from the Q&A. So Johanna, over to you. I'll follow your lead on questions.
Thank you, Christina, for a whirlwind introduction and also for the kind offer to help colleagues set up crypto wallets. I would really encourage you to do this. I've previously had a chance to do it in another engagement with Christina. It is lots of fun, so please make use of that offer. I see a lot of questions coming in, also a lot related to use cases. I think, Christina, you've pointed colleagues in a good direction, so we won't be going there, but we'll be taking lots of examples in upcoming sessions. So we really want to look at the basics now here, so that once we go into the future sessions, we're all really clear on the basics. So the top ranked question is from our colleague Abdi Nasir, and he's from UN Habitat. And he's saying, other than immutability and security features, how is blockchain different from any other database technology?
It's a very, very good question. So there are a lot of similarities, as you mentioned, in terms of immutability and security features. What I often find with blockchain is that it enables a new conversation between multiple groups to share information who otherwise wouldn't have come together around the table. So, and I don't think that's a characteristic of specifically, that it's not inherent in blockchain. It's just because it's a new technology that allows us to share a common set of information. So all of a sudden you have groups who previously wouldn't have talked about sharing information who are starting to talk about the ability to do so. And I think that that's really important. The other thing that I would point out is blockchain does not solve the issue of bad data. If your data you're collecting is bad data, you're going to have that problem whether it's a database or a blockchain. So I think that's really important to point out. So immutability, security, but I would also say coordination. The ability to have multiple parties have access to the same set of information, to be able to contribute information, to manage that information, and be on equal footing when doing so. That is really another differentiator when we're talking about blockchain itself. And if we're talking about public blockchains, we're talking about the transparency that comes with that. That is absolutely a benefit of public blockchains over traditional databases.
Thank you, Christina. Very helpful. Sticking on the topic of immutability, we had a question from Alberto from UNIN, and he's saying, while the probability of altering a record is very low, it is still possible. So could you maybe talk about blockchains being hacked? And I'm going to link onto that another question from a colleague who's saying, well, even if 51% of the blockchain has been altered, the other 49% is still correct. So what actually happens there?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. So I'm going to take a step back and first address the questions of blockchains being hacked. So when we hear blockchains being hacked, we often hear about $30 million was lost, or $50 million were lost, or something like that. Often when we hear about those blockchain hacks, or the way that media portrays them, is actually blockchain wallets that have been compromised. And that's why I thought it was so important to share with you the difference between non-custodial and custodial blockchain wallets. Because if you have a custodial blockchain wallet, and that's where someone is managing your private key on your behalf, that means that that information is probably sitting in a traditional database somewhere, stored by a company. And if a hacker were to get into that database and had access to your private key, they can move all the funds out of your account. And that is what has happened in some of the largest hacks, so to speak, that we've heard about in the blockchain space, where thousands or millions of dollars are being lost, is that actually they're custodial wallets that have been managed on your behalf. Someone gets in, gets your sensitive information, and they move your funds. Very purely, the blockchain has not been hacked in that case. That is a third party who's been managing sensitive information that's been hacked, and the funds have just been moved because they had access over the private keys. So just to demystify that a little bit. In terms of the big blockchain, so the Ethereum blockchain or the Bitcoin blockchain, the actual blockchain, the ledger information itself, those have not been hacked. However, some of the smaller blockchains that may not be as distributed, may not have as many nodes, it is possible for hackers or a group of individuals to take over 51% of the network. And you're correct, 49% of the network would still have the correct copy of the ledger. What often happens in that case is that there is what's called a fork in the ledger. So there's two versions of the truth. There's one which the hackers would be 51%, and then there's the rest where everyone's saying, no, but this is the truth. Then it's really on the, and I'm talking about this in the context of a public blockchain, of course, then it's really on the community to decide, are you going to continue with the string of blocks that goes in the hacker's direction, or are you going to follow the string of blocks that goes into what most people believe is the true source of truth for that blockchain? And so that's where you get what are called forks in a blockchain, and people deciding which one they're going to follow. In some cases, a blockchain might become two blockchains, and then there's a new version of a blockchain that some people decide to keep working on, and another version of a blockchain that others continue working on. So that's also possible. In the case of a private blockchain, I think that's where we really need to consider how decentralized is that blockchain, how secure is it, how likely is it to get attacked, and then you need to start thinking about security considerations as it pertains to that.
Thank you. Piggybacking here, a very quick question from, I believe the colleague is called Jim Reck, and he's saying, is there a minimum size of the network that is required to make blockchain safe against attacks?
That is an absolutely fantastic question. And there is not a formula of an absolute minimum size, but what I will say is that there are some things that you should keep in mind. One is that the more participants you have, the better. And I don't just mean UNICEF setting up a blockchain and having, a copy of the ledger in 100 countries. I think it's important that it be multiple different groups that are part of the blockchain. So that's one thing. You want different groups who are part of it. And that's because the way that it's set up and the value that it brings will be as you have more participants and as you have more diversity. And when I talk about diversity, what's important here is geographic diversity and internet service provider, as well as where you're hosting that blockchain. So geographic diversity, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. You want it to be spread out across the world. Internet service provider, you don't want everyone using the same internet service provider, so that if something were to happen to that one internet service provider, that there would be an issue with your blockchain. So you want lots of internet service providers, and you don't want everyone setting up their blockchain on just Microsoft or just locally or just Amazon. You want a variety, so that if something were to happen with one of those instances, that you still have multiple variations across your blockchain. So it's multiple elements that you're going to want to triangulate to decide which security configuration is going to work best for what you're trying to achieve.
Wonderful. Thank you, Christina. A good reminder that diversity is key in anything innovation related and also in the blockchain. Now, I have a lovely question here from Tala. I wonder if that is one that you have had before. And she's wondering if blockchain applications are tied to one language that is maybe set by the creator, or if it's universal. And if so, how do you overcome challenges of it being streamlined across regions or organizations?
Johanna, can you just repeat the last part of that question? Sorry, you cut out.
Of course. If it is one language, how could you overcome the challenge of information that isn't streamlined across regions or organizations? Can you also put it in the chat for you, so you have it in front of your eyes?
Perfect, thank you. I think in terms of blockchains being tied to one language, they're not. So different blockchains use different programming languages specifically. And I saw that there was a question earlier around what's the most common language used for blockchain. For smart contracts specifically, it's something called Solidity. And that is a new language that was developed specifically for blockchain. And so there's a lot of learning that's happening within the developer community around how to learn this new language and develop in that new language. There's a lot of free resources. And so if that's something that you or colleagues are interested in, it's a great question to ask on the atrium, and happy to provide some resources around that. But the IT community is not new to learning new development languages. And so this is kind of just a natural evolution to have a new language to be able to adapt and work within the construct of what blockchains are able to do.
Thank you, Christina. I realized we're on the hour. I wanted to ask if you might have like a couple more minutes to go through a couple more questions, or if we're losing you to your next meeting.
I think you are losing me to my next meeting. I am very sorry.
I am losing you. No, that is no problem at all. So let me say that, because I'm guessing colleagues also have to run. The webinar was recorded, so you will be able to access it. If you have any of these questions, the 8 that we didn't get to, the atrium is a fantastic place to put them to. And Christina has expressed some sort of a willingness to engage with you there. So please make use of that, while realizing that she also has a day job. Christina, absolutely amazing introduction to blockchain again. I've heard you do it before. I learn a lot every time I hear it. So thank you so much. I think I'm speaking for everyone when I say that. It's a really, really great presentation, and we really appreciate the time you took this morning.
Thank you so much for having me. And yes, please don't be shy to reach out, whether it be on the atrium, via email, LinkedIn, whatever it is. I'm always happy to take questions and have a conversation. So thank you very much for joining.
Thanks, Christina. And to everyone who has had questions that haven't been answered yet, please join also future conversations where we'll be looking into that. So see the top rated question here from Jayant is looking at challenges around blockchain. That is what we are going to be discussing in the next session of this learning series. So please keep on joining for that. And please remember that we'll be sharing it through the blockchain group of the Innovation Network. So you need to sign up there. We'll be including that in the email as well. And with that, I'm wishing you all a good day. Thank you for joining us, and hopefully see you soon. And if Christina is still listening, lots of positive things coming in there for you. So thank you again, Christina. And until next time, bye-bye.